It was a Tuesday, March 4th, 2014. The clock on the courthouse wall read 2:17 in the afternoon when Margaret Elaine Collier signed her name for the last time as a co-owner of anything. The pen scratched against the paper. That was the only sound in the room, that dry, papery scratch, and Margaret noticed it the way you notice a door closing in an empty house. The room smelled of old carpet and something floral trying to cover something worse. The fluorescent light above her head buzzed at a frequency that seemed designed specifically to make a person feel small. She did not cry. She had stopped crying the previous October, on the night she found the accountant's letter tucked behind the bread box, a letter not addressed to her. A letter that made clear that the man she had been married to for 31 years had been, in a very quiet and very legal way, dismantling everything they had built together, piece by piece, for the better part of a decade. She had stood in that kitchen in her bare feet on the cold tile, holding the letter, and she had felt the specific physical sensation of a door she did not know existed swinging shut somewhere deep inside her chest. That was October. Now it was March, and the courthouse smelled like carpet cleaner and defeat, and Margaret Elaine Collier, 64 years old, 5'4", with grey-streaked hair she had stopped dyeing 2 years ago because no one seemed to notice anyway, signed the last page and set the pen down on the table with a precision that was almost careful. Her attorney, a young woman named Deb Howell, who wore sensible shoes and never promised anything, touched her arm once. Brief. Professional. That's done, Deb said. Margaret nodded. What she did not tell Deb, what she had told no one, was that somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the fog of those 6 months, one thing had surfaced like a stone breaking through ice. Her uncle. Dead 3 years now. And a piece of land in the Blue Ridge foothills that no one had wanted. Not her children, not the estate attorney, not her ex-husband's sharp-eyed accountant, who had catalogued every asset of their marriage with the precision of a man who found beauty in columns of numbers. Nobody had wanted the old Collier barn on Route 612. But Margaret had a key. She had been Margaret Elaine Buckner before she was Margaret Collier. She had grown up in Watauga County in the North Carolina mountains, the youngest of 4 children. In a house where the heat came from a wood stove and the windows leaked December in through their corners, and nobody thought anything of it, because that was simply the shape of life. She had been good with her hands. That was the thing people said about her when she was a girl, not pretty, not smart in the way her brother Carl was smart, not musical the way her sister Ruth was musical, but good with her hands. She could fix things. She could look at a broken thing and understand intuitively where the break had actually happened, which was usually not where you could see it, but somewhere before, somewhere upstream. Her father had taught her to do basic electrical work when she was 11. Her uncle Harlan, her mother's brother, bachelor, quiet man, farmer of the old school, had taught her to read a level and set a post and hang a door plumb. He had a deliberateness about him that she had always found calming. He never hurried. He always said that the difference between work that lasts and work that doesn't was 2 inches of patience applied at the right moment. She had carried that with her. Then she had married Dennis Collier when she was 29, and he was charming in the way that certain men are charming completely, like a weather system. A man whose good humour filled a room so entirely that you didn't notice, at first, what the room was missing. Dennis sold commercial real estate. He wore pressed shirts and knew how to talk to anyone, and laughed in a way that made people feel smart for having made him laugh. He was not cruel. That was the thing that made it so confusing for so long. He was not cruel. He was simply organized around himself. In the first years, she worked as a property manager for a small company in Boone. She was good at it. She could spot a maintenance problem 2 months before it became one, could negotiate with contractors without getting taken, could understand at a glance whether a building was sound or merely looked sound. Her boss, an older woman named Paulette, had told her once that she had the best instincts in the office. But Dennis had his own business to run, and it grew, and the work that made most sense for the family, for the schedule, for the children as they came, was the work closest to home. So she left the property company. Just for a while was the understanding. She began handling the administrative side of Dennis's real estate operation. She was good at that too. The while became 2 years. Then, the children were in school, and she was managing not only the office, but the household and the school schedules and the social calendar that Dennis's business required, and somewhere in the managing of all of it she had stopped noticing that she had not touched a level or a circuit board or anything broken, and requiring her specific understanding in almost a decade. It was not one event that changed. It was a series of very small relocations of herself, each one so reasonable in the moment that she could not, even now, identify the exact coordinates of where she had stopped being Margaret Buckner and become Dennis Collier's wife. There were signs she had chosen not to read. The way he described her work to colleagues, Margaret handles the household side of things as if there were 2 businesses and hers was the minor one. The way he made financial decisions and mentioned them to her after, not asking but telling, in a tone that suggested asking would have been an unnecessary formality. The way he had, over years, redirected her opinions until she had stopped offering them in public, and then, gradually, in private. She found out later, much later, that he had begun moving assets into a separate holding company 7 years before the divorce, that the accountant had been his accountant first, had always been his accountant, that the lawyer he suggested they both use at the beginning of what he called an amicable restructuring was someone Dennis had golfed with for 15 years. She had signed things she did not fully understand because she had been told gently that understanding them was not necessary. The children, her son David, 40, who lived in Charlotte and had his father's organized certainty about money, and her daughter Renee, 36, who had not spoken to Margaret in 2 years over something that began as a disagreement about the divorce and became something harder to name, had both sided with their father in the way that adult children sometimes side with the parent who still has things to offer. David had called her in December to explain that their father's position was legally and financially reasonable, and that she should consider accepting the settlement as proposed rather than making things difficult. He used the word difficult twice. She did not say what she wanted to say. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 months. Then she drove south and west on Route 321 out of Boone on a Wednesday morning, the first week of March, when the mountain sky was the particular hard blue of early spring, and the trees on the ridge were still bare, their branches against that blue like dark stitching against cold cloth. She had filled the tank of her 10-year-old Subaru, the car she had kept because it was technically hers, purchased with money from her own account, one of the few things the accounting had not touched, and she had put a single bag in the back. She was not certain how long she was going for. She was not certain of much, which was, she had decided, going to have to be acceptable for now. The roads climbed. The air temperature dropped 4 degrees for every 1,000 feet of elevation, and she could feel it in the way the car handled. Something in the air itself becoming denser and more serious. She passed through Valle Crucis, turned south on a road she knew by the shape of it more than the name, through stands of bare sycamore and tulip poplar, and beginning at the higher elevation, the first cautious blush of red bud on the serviceberry. Serviceberry bloomed first here. That was a thing her Uncle Harlan had told her when she was small. "Watch the serviceberry," he'd said. "When she comes out, the worst of winter's behind you." She had not thought of that in 30 years. She turned onto Route 612 past a gas station that had been a gas station when she was a child and was still a gas station, which felt, in this moment, like a form of loyalty. The pavement became cracked, then gravel, then a track between 2 ridgelines chimney-top to the north, a long unnamed shoulder of rock to the south that local people just called the Wall. She drove for another 3/4 of a mile. And there it was. The Collier property had been in the family, her mother's side, since the 1920s. 43 acres, most of it steep and wooded, with a meadow below where a seasonal creek ran, and at the centre of it all, set back from the road by a long dirt track, the barn. She sat in the car with the engine off and looked at it through the windshield. It was bigger than she remembered, which was strange because things from childhood were supposed to shrink. The structure was old timber-frame chestnut and poplar, she thought, from the colour of the boards with a metal roof that had gone the colour of a February sky. The south-facing wall was draped in last year's dead Virginia creeper, rust brown, still clinging. One of the large sliding doors had come partially off its track and stood at an angle, open about 3 feet to the interior darkness. She could smell it from the car, even with the windows up, hay and old wood, and something underneath, both something cold and mineral, like the breath of the earth itself. She got out. Her shoes pressed into mud at the edge of the track, where the drainage had softened the ground. A pair of crows in the high branch of a tulip poplar to the east watched her with the particular professional suspicion that crows bring to all human activity in their territory. The barn key was on a ring with 2 others. Her uncle's attorney, a man named Gerald Foss from Jefferson, had mailed it to her 3 years ago with a letter explaining that Harlan Buckner had died without a will, and that as the only surviving heir willing to claim the property, it was hers. Her children had been informed and had expressed no interest. Dennis had looked at the tax assessment and the property survey and concluded it was not worth the cost of developing. Nobody wanted it. She walked to the barn door, pushed it open another 2 feet. The interior light was grey and soft, and came from gaps in the siding where boards had shrunk away from one another over the decades. A long central bay. Stalls to the left that had held cattle once. The upper loft running the full length, accessible by a fixed ladder of pine planks still solid in the frame. Old equipment against the far wall, a disc harrow, a hay baler from the 1970s, the rusted carcass of something she couldn't name. And in the far left corner, beneath the lowest point of the loft, and behind what remained of a workbench bolted to the wall, something she had not expected. A door. Not a barn door. An interior door. Wood, painted once the paint had gone to chips, with a metal latch and a simple hasp. Closed but not locked. She stood still in the cool grey light for a long moment. The door was not something she remembered. But then She had not been in this barn since she was perhaps 15 years old, and she had not been a girl who paid attention to doors. She had been a girl who paid attention to what people did with their hands. She crossed the barn floor, the boards solid, not soft, good news for the structure, and put her hand on the latch. Behind the door was a room not much larger than a generous walk-in closet, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The walls were insulated. She could see the old bat insulation tucked between studs, still intact, and the floor was poured concrete, swept clean. A single small window, north-facing, its glass intact and relatively clear. An old wood stove in the corner, cold, with a neat stack of split oak beside it. And shelves. Floor to ceiling, the 3 non-door walls were lined with simple wooden shelves, the kind a man builds himself over a long weekend with good wood and no particular hurry. On those shelves, mason jars of preserved vegetables and fruit that had certainly gone bad, several of them burst at their seals, tools carefully hung on pegboard above the workbench surface in the corner, 2 old coffee cans of fasteners, a stack of agricultural extension bulletins from the 1980s and 90s, rubber-banded, a hand-crank lantern that still worked when she turned it, and, on the lowest shelf nearest the stove, a metal document box, olive green, the kind sold at hardware stores for storing important papers. It was not locked. She carried it to the workbench, set it down, and opened. Inside, a composition notebook, black marble cover, its spine reinforced with electrical tape. Beneath it, a series of manila envelopes, each one labelled in her uncle's handwriting, small, precise, each letter formed with a patience that showed labelled with names. Families, businesses, organisations she had never heard of. She opened the composition notebook first. It had been used as a ledger of sorts. The first entry was dated April 3rd, 1978. The last was dated the previous October, 3 months before Harlan died. 35 years of entries. The format was consistent throughout. A date, a name, an amount, sometimes money, sometimes something else, cord of wood, 3 loads of gravel, labour, 2 days, fence line. Then, on the same line, a brief description, never more than 1 or 2 lines. Just enough to be clear about what the entry was and why. She read the first few pages slowly, the lantern on the bench beside her, the March light coming grey and watery through the small north window. April 3rd, 1978, Bobby Lester. $40. Mother sick, couldn't make the feed store bill. Told him to square it when he could. No interest. June 12, 1978, Earl and Doris Gentry. 2 cords firewood. House fire took their shed and the seasoned wood in it. Left at the road, didn't knock. September 8th, 1978, Clara May Pittman. $200. Oldest boy needs surgery. Jefferson Hospital asking for upfront deposit. She'll pay back what she can. Margaret turned the page. The entries continued. Different names, different amounts, different forms of help, but the structure was the same. The quiet transaction. The deliberate absence of acknowledgement. More than once an entry was followed weeks or months later by a second entry, same name, smaller amount, the word returned in parentheses and then nothing more on that name. He had accepted repayment when offered without making anything of it. He had not kept running tallies of what was owed. He had kept a record of what had been given. There was a difference. She felt it clearly. Reading, she turned to the middle of the book, the mid-1990s. March 15th, 1994, Delbert Winslow. Labour 3 months, barn repair and fencing, in exchange for nothing. He came and asked if he could work to learn. I said yes. He has a gift for timber framing. I told him. October 22nd, 1997, First Baptist, Valet Crucis, anonymous gift to heating fund, $500, cold winter coming. February 2nd, 2001, Heron Creek Fire Department, 300 gallons diesel fuel own expense, station's budget cut by county. Left receipt with Pam at the desk, told her to apply it to the next delivery. She turned more pages. The amounts grew larger as the years went on, not because Harlan Buckner had been wealthy, as far as she had known, but because the farm had done well, it seemed, modestly, and a man who spends nothing on himself accumulates in ways that don't show. Then she turned to the late 2000s and she found her own name. August 14th, 2009, Margaret Collier now. Called her. She didn't call back. Tried again in November. Something's not right in that household. I can feel it the way you feel a rafter that's carrying more than it should. I don't know what to do for her except be patient. Left a note with Gerald Foss. If anything happens to me, she gets this, not the others. Her, she set the notebook down on the workbench. The crows outside called once, twice, then went quiet. She read the entry again. The date on it was 5 years before the divorce proceedings began. Her uncle had sensed, at least 5 years before she herself had admitted it to herself. She put her hand flat on the open page. She did not know how long she stood. Then she picked up the first of the manila envelopes. The one labelled in her uncle's hand, Foss in case. Inside was a letter addressed to Gerald Foss, dated 2 years before Harlan's death. In it, her uncle had written, in his careful handwriting, a set of instructions concerning the property and the document box. The letter noted that the box contained records of outstanding informal arrangements, some financial, some involving goods or labour with various individuals and families in the county. He did not want these treated as debts to be collected. He wanted the records preserved only so that Margaret would understand, if she ever needed this place, that she would not be alone in it. He had used that phrase, "She will not be alone in it." The next envelope was labelled Winslow. Inside, a single folded sheet of paper dated 1994, in 2 handwritings, Harlan's and another. It was a simple agreement. Delbert Winslow, in exchange for 3 months of instruction in traditional timber framing methods, agreed to provide labour on the Collier Barn property at any future date the Buckner family might require. In perpetuity, no compensation expected or accepted. Winslow had signed his name at the bottom, with a hand just learning confidence. She set that envelope aside. She opened each of the others, one by one, in the quiet of that cold small room, the lantern light yellow and steady, the early March wind moving against the metal roof in long, slow waves. There were 11 envelopes in all. 11 families, businesses, each one connected to her uncle by a thread of old kindness. A pastor in Zionville, whose first year of ministry he had funded anonymously. A man named Curtis Webb, who ran a small engine repair shop in Creston and had been given Harlan's entire collection of small engine manuals and tools when he was starting out at age 22. A woman named Pearl Ledford, who had been given the use of Harlan's equipment for 2 growing seasons after her husband left. No charge, no conditions. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a cloth that had once been a feed sack, something she had not expected. A pair of reading glasses, old wireframe, round lenses, the kind that hadn't been fashionable since the 1940s. Her uncle had worn thick framed plastic glasses all his adult life. These were not his. Inside the cloth, on a piece of notepaper, These were your grandfather's. He left them with me for safekeeping. They belong with you." Her grandfather, her mother's father, had died before Margaret was born. She had never seen a photograph of him in glasses. She had never known there was anything of his to be kept. She held the cloth bundle in both hands. The March wind moved the barn, a long, slow creak of timber, like a ship at anchor. She understood then that this was not a place that had been waiting for her to save it. It was a place that had been waiting, quietly and with great patience, to save her. She spent the first night in the barn. Not intentionally. She had planned to drive to the Holiday Inn in Jefferson for the evening. But as the light changed, and the room warmed slightly from the small fire she had built in the old stove, the flue drew perfectly, of course. Because Harlan had maintained it, she found she could not make herself leave. She pulled a moving blanket from the back of the Subaru and set it on a folded length of old canvas in the corner of the small room, and she slept. She awoke at first light to the sound of truck tires on gravel. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, stood at the small window and looked out. A pickup truck, white, well-maintained, maybe 15 years old, had stopped at the end of the barn. A man was getting out. Mid-70s, she guessed, heavy in the shoulders. He wore a canvas work coat and a ball cap with the name of a feed store on it. He stood by the truck and looked at the barn the way people look at places they have not seen in a long time. Margaret opened the barn's side door. He turned, looked at her for a moment without surprise. "You're his niece," the man said, not a question. "Margaret Collier," she said, "Delbert Winslow." He took his cap off and held it in both hands. An old habit from a time when that meant something. "I heard Gerald Foss say you'd be coming out." Eventually, he looked at the barn again. "How is it?" "Solid," she said. "Better than I expected." Delbert nodded, as if this confirmed something. He took care of it, right up till he couldn't. He put his cap. "I come by every month or so the last couple years. Did a few things, nothing structural." She looked at him. "That was you." Replaced 3 sheets of roofing on the back slope. Freed up the big door. Little things. He dismissed it with a wave. "Why?" He looked at her directly. Blue eyes very clear under heavy grey brow. "Because Harlan Buckner spent 3 months teaching me to read a building the way other men read a book. And he didn't charge me a dime for it. And he told me when I left that I had a gift and that I should use it, and I have spent every day since trying to live up to that." He paused. "I don't imagine that's a full answer." "It's enough of one," she said. He looked at the barn. "You know what you have here? Old timber frame. I'm guessing chestnut and poplar." He smiled for the first time, brief, approving. "American chestnut, most of it. Pre-blight, which means pre-1920. You cannot buy that wood anymore. Cannot find it. The barn is worth more than the land it sits on, if it's maintained." He glanced at her. "Which it has been." They stood together in the early morning quiet. Down in the meadow, a pair of Canada geese moved along the edge of the creek. "I found the ledger," she said. Delbert was quiet for a moment. "I figured you would. He wrote about you. I expect he did." Another pause. He was the kind of man who wrote things down because he believed things deserved to be remembered, not because he wanted anyone to. She thought about that. "I'm going to need help," she said. Delbert nodded slowly. "I know. I can't. I'm not looking to be paid," he said. "I want to be clear about that before you say it. I'm not doing this for payment." He looked at the barn once more. "I'm doing it because Harlan asked me to. Not out loud. But I always knew that if someone came here who needed it, I was supposed to be available. He turned to her. So I'm available. He went to his truck and came back with a paper bag from a diner in West Jefferson biscuits, still warm, wrapped in foil, and a thermos of coffee. He set them on the workbench in the small room and sat on an upturned bucket, and she sat on another, and they ate and talked for 2 hours. He told her what he knew of the barn's construction, the joinery, the posts, the way the sill plates had been doubled in the 1940s for added stability. He told her what needed doing first and what could wait. He told her which of the local lumber yards would work with her and which one ran a racket on people who looked uncertain. Before he left, he reached into the pocket of his work coat and set a small spiral notebook on the workbench. Names, he said. People in the county who knew Harlan, who might want to know you're here. He picked up his cap. Up to you what to do with it. She watched him drive back down the track to Route 61. She picked up the notebook. The first name on the list was Winslow's own. She called Deb Howell from the driveway on a Friday afternoon and asked about the property's legal status. Deb confirmed what the estate documents said. The Collier barn property, 43 acres on Route 612 in Ashley County, was Margaret's outright. It had been her uncle's, left informally to her, and whatever the divorce settlement had divided, it had not touched this. Dennis's accountant had reviewed the property 3 years prior and filed it at a tax-assessed value of $31,000. Not worth contesting, apparently. Margaret thought about that number for a moment. Then she went back into the barn. She started with the main door, the one off its track. She found the tools she needed on Harlan's pegboard wall in the small room. A pry bar, a set of channel locks, a mallet, and several hardwood shims. She worked the door back onto its track by herself in about 40 minutes. When it slid closed with a solid, authoritative thunk, she stood still for a moment with her hands on the wood. Something moved in her chest. Nothing she could have named, but real. She began a systematic inspection of the structure. She went over every timber she could reach, pressing her thumb against the wood at every joint, listening for the soft give that meant hidden rot. She climbed the loft ladder it held without complaint and walked the full length of the upper floor, testing boards. She went into the crawl space under the north end of the structure, lying on her side in the cold dirt with a flashlight, reading the underside of the sill plate. Her uncle had been right to double it in the 1940s. The original sill had taken some water damage at the northeast corner. The double plate had carried the load so cleanly that the structure above it showed no indication of any problem at all. She lay in the dirt for a moment, looking at the repair. He told me once, she thought, that when you fix a building, you're in a conversation with everyone who built it before you. She could not remember where or when he had said that. She was not even entirely certain it had been him, but it felt true, lying under there. She came out of the crawl space with dirt on her coat and knees and began making a list in one of Harlan's spare composition notebooks. She was on the 3rd page of notes when she heard a vehicle on the track. Not Delbert's truck. A car. Older, missing on one cylinder, the engine note uneven. A young man got out, perhaps 24, 25, thin in the way of someone who had been eating irregularly, dark circles under his eyes that were only partly from tiredness. He wore a flannel shirt over a thermal and work boots that had been resold at least twice. He stood by the car and looked at the barn with a careful expression, as if he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to be looking at it. "I'm looking for the Buckner property," he said when she came out. "This Route 612? "This is it," she said. "I'm Margaret Collier. Harlan Buckner was my uncle." Something shifted in the young man's face. Hard to read. "I heard in West Jefferson he passed." "I'm sorry. Thank you. What's your name?" "Tyler. Tyler Gentry." He paused. "My grandmother was Doris Gentry. She used to talk about a man named Buckner. Said he helped our family once when she and my grandfather had a fire. I didn't know where to find the place. I was just..." He stopped, looked at his boots. "I just moved back to the county. From Asheville. I had a job at a cabinet shop down there." A pause that said the job was no longer a fact. "I'm trying to get back on my feet. I'm good with wood. Not timber framing or anything like that, but finished work. Furniture, I know how to use tools." He looked up. "I heard maybe there was work here." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "My truck," he said. Then, seeing her expression, "It's fine. I've got a sleeping bag." She looked at the barn, the long clean loft, empty, well insulated, with a good stove flue that could be extended up. She looked back at Tyler Gentry, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has learned not to expect much. "The loft is dry," she said. "There's a stove and a flue stack already up there. You'd have to run the last 8 feet of pipe yourself. I'll pay for the materials." She paused. "In exchange for work. Real work. What I tell you needs doing, when I tell you." He looked at the barn, back at her. "Yes," he said. Simply, they started that afternoon. She showed him the inventory she'd begun. He read it quietly, asking 1 or 2 questions, specific, practical questions, the questions of someone who knew what he was looking at, and she revised her estimate of him upward by several degrees. Delbert came back the next Monday with a trailer and 2 helpers, both men his age, both with the unhurried competence of people who had spent 60-plus years building things, and they began assessing the structure in earnest. She worked alongside them. She made coffee in the small room and carried it out, and nobody talked much because the work spoke well enough. By the end of the first week, she had a clear picture of what the barn was and what it needed. By the end of the second week, she had begun to understand what it could be. Tyler had run the stovepipe in the loft on the second day, using pipe from the hardware store in Warrensville. He had done it neatly and correctly, sealed the penetrations properly, and cleaned up after himself. He slept up there in his sleeping bag, and she could see the orange glow from the loft window on cold evenings when she drove back from the motel in Jefferson where she was staying for now. One morning she came in early and found him at the workbench in the small room, studying Harlan's agricultural extension bulletins. He held one open with the careful attention of someone reading something important, not just something assigned. She did not say anything. She started the stove and made coffee, and he looked up and she handed him a cup, and they went out to begin the day's work. Something about his steadiness, the way he moved through the barn's demands without complaint, without drama, reminded her of Harlan. She did not say this either. Some things did not need to be said at the time they were felt. The first piece of real purpose came 3 weeks in. She had found, in the stalls at the south end of the barn, a set of hand tools planes, chisels, draw knives, spoke shaves wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in a wooden chest that she had initially overlooked. Harlan's woodworking tools. The kind of tools that were made when tools were made to last. She brought them out and laid them on the workbench, and she and Tyler spent an evening cataloguing and cleaning them. At one point she looked up and found Tyler holding a draw knife in both hands, running his thumb along the bevel in a way that was not testing, not curious, was instead something close to recognition. "Can you use that?" she asked. "My grandfather had one," he said. "He taught me to shave chair legs with it when I was 9. She nodded. He set it on the bench with the particular gentleness of someone setting down something they intend to pick up again. It began on a Saturday in late March. Margaret arrived from Jefferson around 8 a.m. to find a truck parked at the end of the track. Not Delbert's. A green Ford F-250, old and freshly washed, with a load of rough-cut lumber in the back. A woman about Margaret's age sat on the tailgate, drinking coffee from a travel mug, wearing insulated coveralls and leather gloves. "You Margaret?" the woman asked. "I am." Janet Sprague. "My father was Curtis Webb. He had the small engine shop in Creston. He died 4 years ago. But before he did, he told me, if anyone ever shows up at the Buckner property needing help, you bring what you can." He nodded toward the lumber. "White oak. I've got a sawmill operation up on Chestnut Creek Road. Consider this a donation to whatever you're doing here." She would not come inside. She helped unstack the lumber and stack it properly bark side up, stickered for drying, in the lean-to on the barn's east side, and when they finished she got back in the truck and drove away. The next Thursday, a man named Roy Absher arrived with his nephew and a flatbed trailer carrying 2 windows, old growth fir framing, single pane but perfectly intact, removed during a renovation in Banner Elk. He had heard from someone who had heard from someone that the barn needed windows for the converted space. He did not explain who had told him. He and his nephew spent 2 hours installing the windows in the south wall of what was becoming a proper workshop. When they were done, Roy declined coffee, shook her hand with a grip that was entirely serious, and drove away with the empty trailer. The following Monday, Pearl Ledford showed up. She was in her late 70s, small, with white hair cropped short, and the upright posture of a woman who had spent decades deciding not to be beaten. She came with a casserole dish covered in foil and set it on the workbench without ceremony. "I grew corn on your uncle's lower meadow for 2 seasons after my husband left," she said. "He wouldn't take a dime. Said the work I put in was rent enough." She looked around the small room. "I've been waiting 20 years for an opportunity to do something about that." She looked back at Margaret. "I can cook, I can bookkeep, I can do anything you need that doesn't involve heavy lifting." A pause. "I also know every family in a 20-mile radius who owes this property a debt of gratitude, and I'm not above reminding them." Pearl began coming 3 days a week. She catalogued the contents of the small room with the precision of a woman who had done the books for a farm her entire adult life. She organized the manila envelopes, cross-referenced the names in the ledger against the county property records, and produced a handwritten summary of what she called the estate of good that Harlan Buckner built and apparently never told a single soul about. She also cooked enormous quantities of soup and cornbread and left containers of it in Delbert's truck and Tyler's loft and on the workbench without comment. Other people came. The pastor from First Baptist in Val Crucis, a young man, surprisingly young, who had heard about the anonymous heating fund donation from his predecessor and had always wondered about it. He came once, stood in the barn doorway for a moment, and then offered the use of the church's small trailer without being asked. A retired electrician named Hank Farris, who had worked 3 jobs simultaneously during a hard winter in 1999, and had received anonymously a cheque that had covered his truck payment and kept his family from losing their vehicle. He never knew who had sent it until Pearl mentioned Harlan's name. He spent a weekend rewiring the barn's electrical panel. He would not discuss payment. He would not even discuss it when Margaret tried. Margaret watched all of this without fully understanding it, and then one afternoon, a Tuesday, mild enough by then, that the serviceberry along the creek edge had come fully into bloom. White flowers against a grey sky, she sat on the tailgate of Delbert's truck with him and Pearl and asked them directly. How many people did he help? Delbert looked at Pearl. Pearl looked at the ledger on her knee. That I can document, Pearl said. 61 families or individuals across roughly 35 years. She paused, but the ledger only records what he thought worth writing down, which, knowing Harlan, was probably about a third of what he actually did. Margaret thought about that. The invisible infrastructure of an entire community, built by one quiet man over decades, without announcement or credit or any apparent need for either. He must have been lonely, she said. Delbert was quiet for a moment. I don't think he was, he said. I think he was full. If you've stayed this long, you already know this story isn't about a barn. It's about something much harder to inherit. Hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. The letter came on a Friday, the first week of April. She found it in her post office box in Jefferson, where she had set up a box because she did not yet have a reliable address in the county. The envelope was from a law firm in Charlotte Hartley, Kern & Associates, and it was addressed to Margaret E. Collier, and it was very formal. And it took her approximately 4 minutes to read in the parking lot of the post office, and she read it twice. The letter informed her, in language that was careful and reasonable sounding, and that she could hear Dennis's voice underneath the way you can hear a hand on a guitar string underneath the note. That a review of the Collier marital estate had identified a potential oversight in the settlement agreement, specifically that the property at Route 612 in Ashe County, while registered in the name of Harlan Buckner at the time of the marriage, and therefore not technically subject to equitable distribution, had nonetheless appreciated in value during the course of the marriage in ways that may reflect shared investment decisions and community improvement. The letter further noted that recent improvements to the property improvements made during the period following the settlement agreement might be considered to have been financed, directly or indirectly, through assets that remain subject to review under the original settlement. They were asking for a meeting to discuss an equitable resolution. The letter was signed by a man named Philip Kern. She sat in the parking lot for a while. She called Deb Howe. Deb was quiet for a moment after Margaret read her the relevant paragraphs. He's fishing, she said. He doesn't have a case for the property itself. The title is clean. But he's going to make noise about the improvements, try to establish that any increase in value is partly marital. Is that a real argument? It's a real argument in the sense that someone can make it, Deb said. It's not a strong one. But it costs money to fight, and they know that. How much money? A pause. It depends. Could be substantial, depending on how far they push it. Margaret drove back to the barn. She did not tell Delbert or Tyler or Pearl about the letter. She worked through the afternoon without it in her conscious mind, which was a trick she had developed over the last year, setting something in an interior room and closing the door and doing the work that needed doing. She refinished the surface of the workbench. She ran beeswax into the wood. She worked until the light changed, and then she swept the floor and drove to Jefferson and ate dinner alone at a diner on Main Street and read the letter again over coffee. Then her phone rang. It was David. She answered because she always answered, because she was still, in some cellular way she could not undo, his mother. "I hear you're out at that barn property," he said. His voice had the quality of a man who has briefed himself before calling. "I am," she said. "Mum," a pause. "I want to be honest with you. I'd appreciate that. Dad's attorneys have identified a possible claim against the improvements you've been making. I know that's not what you want to hear, but honestly, from a financial standpoint, it might make more sense for you to..." He stopped, reconsidered his phrasing. "It might be worth talking to Dad about a buyout of his interest." "He doesn't have an interest," she said. "Technically," his attorneys think. "David," she set her coffee cup down, "your father has not spent one day of his life thinking about that barn. He has not spent 1 hour. He does not care about that property. He cares about whether I have something he doesn't control." A long silence. "I just think it would be easier." "Easier for who?" He did not answer that. "I appreciate you calling," she said. "I do. I'll be in touch." She ended the call and sat for a moment with her hands around the coffee cup, the diner around her warm and low and ordinary, and she felt, underneath the fear that was real and present, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, something else. A steadiness, like a doubled sill plate. She drove back to the barn and spent the night in the small room with the stove burning. Dennis came on a Saturday morning in mid-April, when the redbuds had come out on the lower ridgeline, and the creek in the meadow was running high and clear with snowmelt from the upper elevations. He came in his Mercedes, the newer one, charcoal grey, and he parked it precisely at the end of the track, and got out wearing clothes that said he had thought about coming here more than he would admit. He looked like Dennis. That was the thing. He looked completely, entirely like himself, handsome still, at 68, with the silver at his temples that had always worked in his favour, the careful posture of a man who had decided at some point that posture was a form of credibility. He looked at the barn, and then at the meadow, and then at the serviceberry along the creek edge, and she could see, even from where the moment he did the calculation. He had done the calculation wrong. She could see that too. He had expected to find something in worse shape than this. "Margaret," he said. Dennis. He came up the track without being invited. He looked at the barn's exterior with an expression that cost him something to maintain. "You've been busy." "Some. Roy Apsher put in new windows?" He nodded at the south wall. She said nothing. "I know Roy. We've done business." He paused. "Place looks better than it did. I'll give you that." He was trying to land on a tone. She recognized it, the affable, reasonable tone that preceded a transaction. She had heard it at dinner parties for 31 years. She waited. "Philip Kern says you got his letter." "I did." "It's not personal, Margaret, you know that." "From a legal standpoint, I know what it is," she said. He looked at her. Something in her stillness gave him pause. Good. She had worked for that stillness. She had earned it in the dirt under the northeast corner of a barn in March, with someone else's foresight holding the building up. "I'm going to make you an offer," he said. "Fair market value plus the improvement costs. You take that, you have something real. You can buy yourself a place in town, somewhere with heat that doesn't come from a wood stove. I like a wood stove." He stopped. "Margaret." No, one word. Flat, not angry. Just the word, standing by itself. He looked at the barn again. He looked at the meadow. He looked at the serviceberry with its white flowers catching the morning light. She could see him looking for a different approach the way a man looks for a different door in a building when the first one won't open. "My attorneys are confident in the claim," he said. "Your attorneys are paid to be confident," she said. "That's different." A long pause. She looked at him and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, nothing much. Not hatred, not grief, not even the residual tenderness that had confused her for months after the divorce papers were filed. Just clarity. The way a building is clear to you when you have read it honestly. This is what it is. This is what it needs. This is what it can bear. "I'm going to fight it," she said. "Whatever it costs me. I'm going to fight it." He stood for a moment, the meadow behind, the sound of the creek coming up from below. Then he nodded, once. Not agreement. Not defeat. Something she could not name, but that felt, strangely, like the first honest moment between them in years. He walked back to his car. He drove away. She went into the barn and picked up her tools and went back to work. She did not mark the moment with anything. She simply continued. 3 days after Dennis's visit, Pearl called her at the motel in the morning. "I found something," Pearl said. Margaret drove to the barn. Pearl was in the small room with the document box open on the workbench. She had been working through the remaining contents with her bookkeeper's precision, cross-referencing, noting, and she had found, near the bottom of the box, under a false floor of cardboard not hidden. Exactly. Just set aside for safeness a manila envelope that had not been with the others. It was labelled, in Harlan's hand, property. Legal. Do not overlook. Inside was a document. Not the deed, she had the deed. But a second document, a conservation easement agreement filed with Ashe County in 2004 and with the state of North Carolina, placing the Collier barn property into a voluntary conservation program. The easement had been drafted by an environmental law firm in Boone and executed by Harlan Buckner as property owner. The effect of the easement was that the property could not be subdivided, could not be developed for commercial purposes beyond small-scale agricultural use. And critically, any assessment of its value for legal purposes was subject to the restrictions of the easement, which substantially limited what any party could claim as a financial interest in the appreciated value of the land. Beneath the easement document was a letter from the environmental law firm. Dated 2004. Addressed to Harlan Buckner. Dear Mr. Buckner, per our earlier conversation, the easement has been recorded and filed as discussed. I want to reiterate, as I have several times in our meetings, that you owe us nothing for this work. You helped my family during a period when we had no one else, and this is a debt I am glad to have the opportunity to repay. Please do not send payment. My firm is honoured to be of service to this property and to the Buckner legacy. Marcus Hayes, Hayes Environmental Law, Boone, NC. Pearl had already found the number. Margaret called Marcus Hayes's office. Marcus Hayes was 71 years old. He had founded the firm after 20 years of practice in Charlotte. He had grown up in Ashe County, in a family that had gone through a period of severe hardship in the early 1990s, his father's medical bills, an impossible situation, and a man named Harlan Buckner had, quietly and without fanfare, provided enough assistance over 3 years that the family had kept their land and Marcus had been able to finish law school. He remembered Harlan precisely. He was quiet on the phone for a moment when she said her name. "I've been waiting for this call," he said, "or a call like it. Gerald Foss told me once you'd probably end up out there." She explained the situation. He listened without "The easement holds," he said when she'd finished. "Any claim your ex-husband's attorneys have regarding appreciated value runs directly into the conservation restrictions. The property's legal designation specifically limits any commercial valuation argument. They have no case." A pause. "And honestly, if they want to try anyway, I would be very happy to appear in that courtroom." "Mister, I'll also be very clear," he said, with a warmth that was professional and also personal simultaneously, "that I am doing this for free. Not as a favour. As an obligation. There's a difference." A pause. "Your uncle would have understood that." "He would," she said. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended. Pearl was watching her from the other side of the workbench. "He put the easement on 20 years ago," Margaret said. "He put a lot of things in place 20 years ago," Pearl said. "He just didn't tell anyone." Margaret looked at the document, at the date 2004, 5 years before he had written her name in the ledger, 15 years before she knew she was coming here. He had known. He had always known. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope back exactly where Pearl had found it. Some things deserved to stay where they were placed. Tyler had been living in the loft for 6 weeks. He had become useful in the way that good workers become useful, not by expanding dramatically, but by being reliable in all the small things, which accumulated into something substantial. He showed up when he said he would. He asked questions only when he genuinely didn't know. He had an eye for finish work that was genuinely exceptional, a quality of attention to surface and joint that made Delbert, who did not offer praise casually, say once that the boy had carpenter's eyes. He didn't talk about Asheville, or why he'd left, or what had come before. She didn't ask. She had been the person others didn't ask for long enough to understand that the asking wasn't always as kind as it felt. She gave him space. She gave him work. She paid him fairly from the modest funds she had managed to consolidate after the settlement, and she did not make a production of either. In the 5th week, she had sent him to reorganize the tools and materials in the small room, catalogue them, record them, bring some order to what had become an active working space overlaid on Harlan's original arrangement. She expected him to be done in a few hours. At the end of the day, she came in to find him sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, with one of Harlan's manila envelopes open in his hands. Not the legal ones, not the property ones. One of the smaller personal envelopes she had moved to the back of the box. The ones that contained individual notes and photographs and small records things that had not seemed immediately relevant to the property situation. She stopped in the doorway. He had not heard her come in. He was looking at a photograph. Black and white, 3.5 by 5, the kind made by a drugstore developer in the 1980s. He was looking at it with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror in the weeks after she first read the ledger. Recognition, and behind it, something cracking open. She looked at the photograph from where she stood. 2 people. A man in his 30s she recognized a young Harlan, without the grey, but the posture entirely the same, and a boy, maybe 10 years old, in overalls, both of them at the workbench in this room. The boy holding a hand plane in the way you hold something you are just learning to hold. The boy was grinning at something out of frame. and the man was looking at the boy with the expression of someone watching exactly what they hoped to see. She looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at the photograph. She could see the moment he found the name on the back, she could see his hand turn the photograph over, slowly, and she could see him read it. She was too far away to read it herself, but she saw his shoulders change. A different quality of stillness came over him. He sat like that for a long time. She stepped back out of the doorway as quietly as she could. She went out into the barn and sat on the tailgate of her car. After a while she heard him in the loft, moving quietly. Not upset, not distraught. Something else. She thought about his grandmother, Doris Gentry, in the ledger entry from 1978, the firewood left at the road in the night. Earl and Doris Gentry. She thought about what that photograph would have meant if it was dated 10 years after that ledger entry. A debt of kindness, paid forward into the shape of time spent with a child. She said nothing to him. Not that evening, not in the days after. He put the photograph, as far as she could tell, somewhere on the shelf above his sleeping area in the loft. His work in the weeks after had a different quality. Not better, exactly, more rooted. Margaret Collier drove up on a Sunday morning in May. The serviceberry had gone, and the rhododendron was coming in along the lower slope, the buds not yet open, still tight purple-green against the rock faces. The meadow had greened up completely, and the creek ran lower and clearer, and you could hear it from the barn on still mornings as a constant low conversation. Renee drove a new car, quieter than Dennis's Mercedes, but newer than anything Margaret owned. She was 36, and she looked it, in the way her father's people had always looked their age straight in the face without flinching. She had her mother's colouring grey eyes, the brown hair that Margaret had passed to all her children. She got out of the car and stood in the morning sun and looked at the barn with an expression that Margaret, watching from inside, could not read from this distance. Margaret did not go out. Not from stubbornness. She was in the middle of something. She was fitting a shelf bracket in the north wall of the workshop space, and she was at the moment in that process when stopping means starting over, so she did not stop. Renee let herself through the side door. She stood in the central bay and looked. At the swept floor, at the repaired windows, at the tools hung with precision on Delbert's restored pegboard, at the new electrical panel Hank Farris had installed, at the workshop space taking shape at the north end where the stalls used to be, where Tyler was running the plane across a board of white oak, long, steady, curl by curl, the smell of fresh-cut wood filling the barn. Tyler looked up, nodded, went back to the board. Renee walked the length of the barn. She came to the doorway of the small room where Margaret was still working, and she stood in the doorway and looked. At the stove, burning low. At the shelves, organised. At the ledger, open on the workbench Pearl had been in the day before, and left it open to a page she was cross-referencing. Renee's eyes moved to the ledger. She stepped into the room. She read. Margaret set her bracket down and moved to the workbench and stood on the other side of it, and waited. Renee read slowly. She turned pages. She found the name she recognized. Margaret was close enough now to see and she could see Renee's finger stop on a line in the early 2000s, an entry that named a mutual friend of the family, someone from the years when the Collier children were young and the family had seemed solid and the future had seemed arranged. An entry that noted the friend had been quietly helped through a crisis none of the children had known about. Renee's face was still. Then she turned to the entry dated August 2009, the one with Margaret's name. Something's not right in that household. I can feel it the way you feel a rafter that's carrying more than it should. Renee, read it once. Read it again. Set the notebook back on the bench. She looked at her mother. He knew, she said. Her voice was low. He knew, Margaret said. A long pause. I didn't, Renee said. I didn't know. She was not defending herself. She was just saying it. Just putting it in the room and leaving it there. I know, Margaret said. Another pause. Dad's attorneys dropped the claim, Renee said, this week. I thought you should hear it from me. Margaret had already heard it from Marcus Hayes. But she let Renee have the delivery of it. I was wrong, Renee said. Just that. One sentence stated plainly, without performance or expectation. Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. Do you want coffee? She said. Something moved in Renee's face. Something that had been held tight for a long time. Yes, she said. They went out into the barn and Margaret made the coffee on the small camp stove she kept on the workbench, and they stood together in the morning light with the smell of the coffee and the fresh cut white oak and the old chestnut around them. Tyler worked steadily at the far end, not intruding, not making himself smaller either, just present. Renee watched him work. Who is he? She asked. Tyler Gentry, Margaret said. His grandmother was someone your great-uncle helped a long time ago. Renee watched the long plane strokes, the curls of oak falling to the floor. Can I stay for a while? She asked. Yes, Margaret said. Summer came into the Blue Ridge the way it always does, not all at once, but insistently, the days warming degree by degree, the mornings holding on to cool until later and later each week, and then one day you realize the cool isn't coming back until October, and you have somehow crossed a threshold without noticing it. The barn workshop took its final shape in late June. Well, good lighting Hank Farris had wired it properly, with diffused overhead and task lighting at each bench. Tool storage that Tyler had built from the white oak Janet Sprague had brought in April, fitted and organized with a precision that would have satisfied Harlan, she thought. A small finishing room at the north end, properly ventilated. The old stalls repurposed as material storage along the south. She offered one-on-one woodworking instruction out of it. 3 days a week. Nothing fancy, just what she knew, which was the basics, and what Tyler knew, which was developing into something more. She charged a reasonable rate. She waived it when waiving was indicated, and she did not make a production of the waiving. She noted it in a composition notebook she had bought at the hardware store, a black marble cover, because some habits are inherited, and that is exactly as it should be. In July, the pastor from First Baptist asked if she would consider holding a Saturday class for the congregation's youth group. She said yes. Tyler ran it. He was 25 years old, and he stood in front of 12 teenagers with a piece of white oak and a hand plane and showed them, with the same patience she had watched him absorb from the tools and the wood and the old man's presence still somehow in this room, how to take one proper shaving. She watched from the doorway. She had, by then, paid off one small debt she'd found in the ledger, a family in Lansing, whose connection to Harlan she'd confirmed through Pearl in the same way Harlan had done it. An envelope. No note. Dropped in a mailbox on a Thursday evening. No one watching. She drove home in the dusk with the windows down and the mountain air coming in and the smell of the rhododendron giving way to late summer, and she did not feel extraordinary about what she'd done. She felt, if anything, ordinary, which was exactly the feeling. In August, Tyler came to her with a proposal. He had been corresponding, she had not known this, with a woodworking school in Asheville. Not his former employer. A school. He had put together a portfolio of work he'd done in the barn workshop, and the school was interested in featuring his work in their fall exhibition. He showed her the email. She read it. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to submit the credenza," he said. "The one in the corner." A pause. "I want to put on the submission that I made it at the Buckner barn in Ashe County, if that's okay." She thought about that. "The Collier barn," she said. He nodded. "Then, I want to put both names on it, if that's okay. Buckner and Collier. Because both names are part of what made it." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. In September, Pearl brought her a list. A new list: families, individuals, situations she had identified in the county through the kind of research that only a woman with Pearl's contacts and Pearl's precision could conduct, situations where the old Harlan Buckner infrastructure had not quite reached, or had lapsed in the years since his death. "I thought you should know what's out there," Pearl said. Margaret took the list. She did not read it immediately. She set it in the composition notebook, and set the notebook on the shelf above the wood stove in the small room, next to the hand-crank lantern and next to the wireframe glasses in their cloth. She would get to it, one at a time, one entry at a time. It was a Thursday morning in early October. The maples on chimney top had turned the whole ridge lit orange-red above the grey rock face, the kind of colour that looks like it ought to be louder than it is, like it ought to make a sound. The air was 42 degrees and smelling of fallen leaves and the faint mineral edge of the first frost that would come in the next week or so. She was in the workshop when the footsteps came across the gravel. A woman. She did not know her. Perhaps 60, perhaps older age sits differently on people who have worked hard, and this woman had worked hard. It was in her hands, in the way she carried her shoulders. She had parked an old Nissan at the end of the track, and walked up and stood in the barn doorway in a way that said she was not certain she was welcome to stand there. "Excuse me," the woman said. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Bet Shumate. I'm from Sugar Grove." A pause. "I heard someone told me in Jefferson there was a woman out here who did woodworking instruction." "That's right," Margaret said. "I lost the use of most of my right hand last year." She held it up. 2 fingers fused at the knuckle from what looked like an old industrial injury. "I had a surgery. I'm in physical therapy. The therapist says I need to do fine motor work, repetitive but progressive." She looked at the shop. She said working with wood might help. "But I can't afford," she stopped. "I don't have a lot of money right now." Margaret looked at her. She thought of Bobby Lester in 1978, of Clara May Pittman and her son's surgery, of the cord of wood left at Earl and Doris Gentry's road in the night without a knock. "Can you come on Wednesday mornings?" she said. The woman blinked. Yes. Yes, I can." "We start at 8, Margaret said. "Bring an apron if you have one. If you don't, I have extras." She paused. "First few weeks we'll just work on grip and stroke. Nothing to make. Just to remember what your hands know." The woman's throat moved. "How much?" "We'll figure something out when the time comes," Margaret said. She went back to the board she was working. The woman stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you," and her footsteps receded back across the gravel. Margaret worked for a while in the quiet. At some point she became aware of the light changing, the October sun moving low and amber across the workshop floor, the way mountain light does in fall, like something taking its time leaving. She set her plane on the bench. She walked to the small room. The stove was burning low. The room smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and old paper and something she could not name, but that she had always associated with this building. This specific air. The breath of a place that had been cared for long enough to hold it. On the shelf above the stove, exactly where she had set them, 6 months ago, on a cold March evening when she had not known what she was holding, the wire-frame glasses in their cloth, her grandfather's. Kept in safekeeping for 50 years by a man who believed that some things deserved to be preserved until the right person came to find them. She did not touch them. She stood and looked at them in the amber October light. She thought about what her uncle had written. In August 2009, in this room, at this bench, with a hand that had learned to be patient and precise. She will not be alone in it. The clock, she had noticed that morning, had needed its battery replaced. She had done it early, before anyone arrived. It was the small round clock above the workbench, her uncle's, there for 35 years, and she had replaced the battery and set the time and hung it back exactly where he had kept it. She looked at it now. 2:17 in the afternoon. The same time as the courthouse clock on the day she had signed everything away. She had not planned that. She had simply read the time on her phone and set the clock, and that was what it was. She stood in the warm, smoky, amber-lit room. She went back to work.